Good evening. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Sometimes you just forget to turn on your microphone. Hello, hello. Good morning, evening, afternoon. Whatever the time is, it is time for some Spice and Wolf. My voice. But first, let's stretch. Ooh. How is everyone doing? I hope you're doing quite well. Just as I am. Yeah. Stream health. What is it? YouTube. Sounds working fine, YouTube. I don't know what your... Sounds working fine, YouTube. I don't know what your... Oh well. YouTube sent a message like, hey, your sound's not working. I'm like, it is. Oh well. Yeah, I am having a blast of a time. Spent the whole day playing Yakuza. But I think I'm quite done with Yakuza 0 for now. At least I finished the mini games, the mini games, the real estate and cabaret club, and now it's just grinding for more CP so I can unlock the final few things in the legendary fighting stance. But even if I unlock the final things in that, what am I gonna do? I can't fight anything with the legendary fighting stance, so... Oh well. But yes. Oh, now the stream healthy again. Okay, thanks YouTube. Yes. But this week, start Yakuza Kiwami Itzy. That is Japanese for one. Kill me. Yes. All at. Check one thing. Oh well. I can't wait for Yakuza 1. I've heard some good things about it, so... Also, I'm guessing you don't, because I heard a lot of people say you can't really play Majima, or at least like you can't really play other characters in Yakuza Kiwami 1. It's just sad because I absolutely love the Mad Dog style of Majima. The Mad Dog of Shimano? I don't know, but his fighting style feels it's so fast and feels so fun. A lot better than the Dragon of Dojima. That's why I don't know. It just felt so underwhelming. Especially because, like, all other fighting styles you can level and get new abilities, and this fighting style is just like, it's here. It's a mix of the other three. which I guess is fine, but the same thing for Majima. But like his fighting styles were already pretty fun, and now they took all the fun parts out of it and gave it a knife. Oh well. But we're not here today for Yakuza. We're here for the Spice and Wolf. The Spice and Wolf. So let's get to yes. I still haven't figured out how to do this properly, but oh well. Who cares? So let's just get started. Chapter 6. I don't know if this is the last one. It's at 80% done, and I'm got scared of how long this chapter is gonna be. If it's the last one. White breath trailed behind them as they walked. The exhalations warmed their cheeks momentarily, but with every breath, they soon turned to a painful chill. The darkening sky had finally lost its patience, and just after midday, the thin drizzle began to fall as if shaved from a giant block of ice. Thus, Lawrence's face was so cold he wondered if it had actually frozen. But whenever a bit of air found its way onto his clothes, it was just pleasantly cool. They ran. The people, the horses, the sheep, the dog. There were eyes on them, many of them. There were presences too. But no matter how watchful the group was, not a single howl was heard, nor a single clump of fur seen. And eventually the weather and the hot effort robbed them of their ability to worry about the wolves. It was as if something had aimed for that gap. By the time Hollow noticed this, they were already surrounded by wolves. Enoch! Nora's voice echoed, and Enoch sprinted to the rear of the flock, in a blur of black fur and white breath, driven on a lagging lamb. The lamb sprinted desperately, but was unable to distinguish between the dog and the wolf, and the wolf's howls echoed as if to mock it. The situation was clear. The cry had come from a wolf atop the rocky hills to the right, as if it tried to collect the sheep. In contrast, the little howling could be heard from the forest on the left side. Little howling could be heard from the forest on the left side. What could be heard were footfalls and panting. On the far side of the ferns and the undergrowth beneath the trees, Lawrence and the others ran side by side. Lawrence and Hollow sat astride their horse. Likewise, Liebert rode his. Nora's bangs were plastered to her forehead from the sleet and sweat that she used both Enoch and her staff to control the sheep. When it came to the wolves, well, if they were surrounded, that would mean the end. Wolves hunted carefully, making sure none of their pack was injured in the process. There would be no plan to use a single wolf as bait. Nor would a single member make a heroic attack on its own. Wolves were cautious to the end, and always conducted themselves with cunning. Thus, if the group could put themselves in a position to kill just one wolf, as the pack tried to tighten the noose, they could free themselves from any further harassment. Lawrence listened to Hollow's hasty explanation and saw that Nora moved to do just that. A single wolf was visible in a brief flashes. Turn down the music a bit. It's a bit too far down. Okay, that's better. trying to get ahead of the and cut off their route, but it would be instantly diverted by either Enoch being sent out ahead or Lawrence himself plunging ahead. When the wolves moved too slowly close to the loop, the sheep would be made to dash in some wild direction, breaking the line. For a shepherd, sheep are not poor children to be protected, but a shield, a weapon to be the wielder like any other. It was not Lawrence's or Liebert's time to act. Liebert was fully engaged, holding the reins in one hand and keeping the gold within his jacket secure with the other. For his part, Lawrence could only ask Holo what he should do. What to do, eh? The road was terrible and much worse on the back of a trotting horse. Impacts were constant, and if it felt like one's head was about to separate from one's body, keeping Holo, who sat in front of him, from being thrown off was work enough. What to do indeed. Her insinuation was bad. Initiation was bad, and not necessarily just because the bumpy ride made it easy to bite one's tongue when talking. Listen. What? About my explanation before. I take it back. Explanation before? Lawrence was about to ask when the grass diagonally behind them in the forest rustled. And immediately thereafter came the sound of claws digging into earth. Lawrence felt an intense chill run down his back, as if the wings had sprouted from there. It was not a chill that could be described as merely hot or cold. It was a message of danger, or from the very grave. Enoch! With superhuman intuition, Nora sensed the attack as she ran well ahead with the sheep. She quickly raised her staff to summon her black-furred knight, but their last hope was the hill that lay ahead. Naturally, wolves realized this as well. A brown fur brule came streaking at the legs of Lawrence's horse. It was do or die. Lawrence was about to pull back on the reins with all he had, but Holo put her hand out and stopped him. Then looked over her shoulder. She spoke. Fall back. The reason Lawrence understood what she had spoken to, none other than the wolves themselves. That was the reason Lawrence had understood that she had spoken to none other than the wolves themselves was the surging pack suddenly wheeled aside and stopped, as if struck by arrows. Nora, Lawrence, and the others weren't the only ones surprised. The bemusement of the halted wolves themselves was obvious by looking at them. Yet Lawrence could neither praise the feat as amazing nor give his thanks to Holo for saving them. Holo's normally red-brown eyes flashed ruby bright. To look at her was to be afraid. Holo the wise wolf was among them. The humans as well. Her cold voice reminded Lawrence of when he'd first seen her true form. Youngsters these days, I suppose I could say. Lawrence wondered for a moment what she was talking about, then suddenly he realized what she meant. Though the immediate danger had passed, Nora did not understand why. Doubt tinged her face, but there was no time to think, preparing to face whatever crisis came next. Enoch steadily carried out rapid-fire orders given to him by his mistress. Liebert clung desperately to his horse, trying only to avoid dropping the gold. If they kept going at this speed, they would be able to put the forest behind them by sundown, and to put this danger behind them. They had no choice but to try. Then it resounded. At first it seemed like the wind. There was a whoosh, as the icy drizzle was blown back for a momentarily into the sky. It was soon clear that it was a strange wind indeed. A normal gale didn't chill one's core the way this one did. The wind was immediately followed by a sound, a tremendous force-splitting roar, battered on their eardrums on one side. The overwhelming blast was enough to freeze a person's breath. The horses stopped, the sheep stopped, even the gallant sheepdog was frozen in its tracks. The violent roar seemed to nail everyone to the ground. They stood as statues, looking into the forest. "Listen," said Hollow quietly to Lawrence. Everything was still. The only sound was a drizzle falling on the earth. Was the drizzle falling on the earth. "This is the trouble I must bear. When I send the girl and the kid on, you'll have to stay back for a time as well." Why? There is a stillness. There in the stillness, Nora and Liebert did not seem to take notice of Hollow and Lawrence's exchange as they glared unblinkingly into the forest. But it wasn't that they hadn't noticed. It was the same as the hound that had cornered a bird. Even as the hunter moved its hand to strike, the bird could not fly away. They were unable to take their eyes off the forest. Because what's in the forest is no normal wolf. You understand, yes? Hollow slowly looked away from the forest, turning to Lawrence. His legs went weak at those eyes. Her expression was well past displeasure. Her eyes flashed with such anger that Lawrence wondered if she might rage at the very cobblestone in the road. Her breath was slow. It was like a demon horse in hell. If I go along with them, the pack will chase the sheep no longer. Those sheep are not their aim. She turned back to the forest. Such cheap bluster, such rough pride. Both prized by the young, I suppose. Hollow was still mostly within Lawrence's arms, and she seemed almost to swell as she spoke. It took Lawrence a moment to realize that it was from the swishing of her tail beneath her robe. "Go! They won't move until you speak. You're my partner, and partners cooperate, do they not?" Hollow's expression was suddenly softer, and Lawrence found himself nodding. He was a merchant and generally hopeless at anything save business. For Hollow's part, there was none who knew more of wolves than she did. "We'll take it from here. The two of you take the gold and go as planned." Lawrence hadn't planned to shout, but Nora and Liebert snapped out of their reveries as though they had heard the voices in the middle of the night. There were no objections. In situations like these, to leave the seemingly weak ones behind as a sacrifice was so that the strong can live was a well-used tactic. But they did seem to look at him questioningly. "Is this all right?" Their eyes asked. No matter how established the tactic, it was possible for a grizzled mercenary band. No matter how it established the tactic, what was possible for a grizzled mercenary band was not so for a regular traveler. "We shall meet at the walls of Ruvenhagen, and we'll all be rich." Of course, Hollow had no intentions of becoming a sacrifice, but there was no way the others could know that. At the same time, she spoke. At the same time, she could not very well explain herself, so she just smiled lightly as she spoke. He was taking advantage of human nature. People wouldn't waste the sacrifice of someone facing near certain death with a smile and faint hope. A clever wolf knew how to use that fact. Liebert was the first to nod his agreement, followed by Nora. Nora waved her staff and time seemed to start moving again. "The fortunes of the war be with you," said Liebert. Nora gave Hollow a look more eloquent than words, and then soon turned away. As he heard the sound of the sheep starting to turn, Liebert followed after them. Hollow watched all this, then turned to Lawrence. "You'll need to stay away. If you get too close, it could go badly. You understand, I know. You understand? I know." Instead of answering, Lawrence took Hollow's hand before she dismounted the horse. "I won't let you lose. I won't let you lose," he said. Her hand was surprisingly hot, and she returned his gaze. "Were you a proper male, I'd at least get a kiss for my trouble here." Hollow grinned for a moment before her expression tightened and she hopped off the horse. "Oh, that's right. Here, take this from me," she said, undoing the sash at her waist and taking a robe off quickly. Her flowing chestnut hair, pointed wolf ears, and fluffy wolf tail were all exposed, as was the slightly swaying wheat-filled leather pouch around her neck. "It is my hope that this will all conclude peacefully, but I don't know how it will go. When we meet up again, it will be cold if I'm naked, and a bit of a problem for you too. I should think," she said with a smile and then looked to the forest, unmoving. Her tail bristled as though struck by lightning. Lawrence hesitated over what to say. What finally came out was short. What finally came out was short. "Let's meet again." He didn't wait for a reply before spurring the horse on. Saying he didn't want to remain there would have been a lie, but what could he accomplish if he did? Lawrence knew Hollow's true form. Even if she were cornered by mercenaries or bandits, she could get away. Lawrence drove the horse on. The sleet got heavier. His face was strained, and not just because of the cold. For the first time in his life, he cursed himself for not being born a knight. It appeared that Nora and Liebert had travelled some distance ahead in a short time. Lawrence did as he was told and had the horse at a gallop in order to put distance between himself and Hollow. But even running at a fair pace, he had yet to catch sight of Nora or Liebert. He no longer felt those unpleasant gazes, so this was probably a good opportunity to make progress. That was certainly true from Nora and Liebert's perspective. They would not want to waste Lawrence and Hollow's death. Lawrence smiled grimly to himself at the thought, and the concern about losing his way flitted out in and out of his mind. However, it soon dispersed. He was not especially familiar with the territory, but once the sun went down, he would have to stop, and he couldn't lose his way while at a standstill. As long as he kept the hills to his right and the forest to his left, he would not stray too far, of course. Additionally, farther down the way, the grass was clipped short and called a road. And if he followed that, it would take him straight to Ruvenhagen. Even if he never caught up with Laura or Liebert, there was little to be worried about. Lawrence was more worried that his horse would stumble over a stone fall. So he pulled back on the reins and slowed the animal, then looked back over his shoulder. Holo had long since disappeared, but if the wolves changed their mind and came after him, they would cover distance quickly. He fought back the temptation to stay there and turned forward again, spurring the horse onto a walk. Spurring the horse onto a walk. He had Holo's robe. It was still warm. It seemed like a bad omen to leave clothing behind as a token. Lawrence felt himself grip the robe tightly, but if Holo found it necessary to take wolf form, she would be in trouble. Trouble if she had no clothes to change into. She was even more rational than Lawrence, the merchant. Lawrence sighed deeply, shaking out the robe which had a good deal of shed fur on it, probably from Holo's tail. He folded the garment up and stuffed it inside his own coat, which was already fairly wet, but that was better than holding it under his arm. Holo had taken the most dangerous role of all, so at least the least he could do was make sure her clothes weren't soaking wet when she returned. The drizzle was getting heavier. It would be real rain by nightfall. Lawrence continued on horseback for a bit, then stooped in the middle of the path. Stopped in the middle of the path, deciding that he had come far enough. Even if he had not put a lot of distance between them, it would require some effort for Holo to catch up with him, assuming she was in human form. However, standing here in the middle of the road was a tantamount to suicide. The cold had already numbed Lawrence's hand as they gripped the reins. It would be better to take shelter in the forest and keep an eye out for Holo coming down the road. He was worried about freezing to death. Before she ever found him. Lawrence dismounted under the trees at the edge of the forest. Looking back up the road, the space between the forest and the hills was mostly open. Nora and Liebert had probably already cleared the edge of the forest and were making their way straight to Ruvenhagen. They were moving faster than normal, so it was entirely possible. If so, then truly the only thing that remained to be done was feeding the gold to the sheep and entering the city. As long as that went well, the gold smuggling would have wiped out his debt, and turned a large profit for him to boot. Lawrence's promised share would be to clear his debt and leave him with 150 lumione. That was a staggering amount of money, but still small in comparison to the total profit of the smuggling would yield. They had bought up 600 lumione worth of gold, and avoiding the taxes on it meant it would be multiplied tenfold. If he had been greedier, he probably could have gotten a larger share. After all, he was an accomplice to smuggling, a fact that the rest could hardly ignore. He stopped himself. Being greedy invited misfortune. It was the way of the world. Lawrence tried to keep his mind off the cold as he gathered up what dry wood he could find, taking some tinder from a carefully waterproof bag on the horse and started a fire. There was nothing around him. It was quiet without so much as a hint of an animal in the area. As he dried his clothes, Lawrence wondered if Holo was all right, thinking of the robe she had taken off. Such thoughts did him no good. He realized he couldn't help himself. His was the sin of helplessness, he felt. He kept watch over the plains as the drizzle continued to fall. How long had he stared at the unmoving scenery? His clothes were mostly dry. The first log he had set fire to was now ash. Perhaps he would go check on her. The seductive thought began to fill his mind. There was a change in his field of vision. He rubbed his eyes. It was no mistaken. It was a person. Hollow! He shouted, standing in spite of himself and grabbing Hollow's now dry clothes as he began to run. He would not possibly encounter anyone else in a place like this. But as he ran in the rain, he soon realized that it was not Hollow. There were 3 human forms. They were on horseback. Mr. Lawrence, is that you? Apparently, they had heard Lawrence's voice as he called out. And they called his name. Lawrence realized they were from the Remilio Company. But what were they doing here? Mr. Lawrence, are you alright? He had no recollection of their faces. One had a bow at his back. A sword hung from the belt of another, and the third carried a long spear. Their faces and postures showed that they were more used to travel than a town merchant like Liebert. And they wore rain gear as though they were used to it and ready to... Rain gear as though we were used to it and ready to fight at a moment's notice. We heard from Mr. Liebert. We couldn't just stay at the company, so we came out and waited at the edge of the forest. Thank goodness you're... The words cut off there. The men, perhaps slightly older than Lawrence, had caught sight of the rope he held. It was hollow, and thus on the smallish side, and obviously for a woman. The obvious conclusion was not a good one. They must be thinking he held on to the rope as a last memento, that she had met with tragedy. They had surely heard him call out Hollow's name before. As Lawrence expected, they looked at him sympathetically. He tried to think of how he might clear up the misunderstanding when he noticed something strange. The 3 men had simultaneously taken a deep breath and... taken a deep breath, and Lawrence caught a glimpse of something like relief on their faces. No doubt not one of them thought this showed, but the merchant's eye caught it. They were probably glad that Lawrence had not succumbed to despair and was impossible to manage, and become impossible to manage. And your things? If they felt pity for this poor man whose beloved companion had been killed by wolves, the point of broaching the subject had passed. If they dwelt on the topic for too long, there was no telling when his emotions would explode. It was often the strangely composed ones who were dangerous. Knowing it would be foolish to try and explain the misunderstanding, Lawrence merely gestured behind him. Over there, a horse as well. I see, let's take some shelter for a bit. The tone was casual, but the 3 men's expression was tight when they dismounted. They were probably wondering if they were going to find the girl's wolf-mauled body. Lawrence turned on his heel and to lead them to his horse. Some moments later, his mind went blank from shock. Lawrence turned on his heel to lead him to his horse. Okay, shock. I won't ask you to think badly of us. It came a calm voice. Lawrence's left arm was twisted from behind, and a spear pointed at his flank. There was a sword at his throat. The droplets ran down his face. Were not only rain. So the Remilio Company is betraying me? Lawrence somehow managed to ask, stifling the cry as he felt his shoulder twisted. It was luck that kept him from dropping Hollow's clothes. It's insurance. The sword at his throat was pulled away so that he could be tied up. The men confiscated Hollow's rope and bound Lawrence up like a piece of luggage. It weighed heavy on us to hear there would be a girl with you. So that's lucky anyway. The expressions of relief earlier were because Hollow had not been there. And the men had known that if somebody tried to be a hero, they would not pass the day without seeing blood. I know it will sound like an excuse, but we're on the brink here. We have to eliminate any danger we can. The Remilio Company had clearly assumed that Lawrence planned to blackmail them. Even if they did manage to come back from the edge of bankruptcy by smuggling gold, anyone who knew that fact was as good as a knife to the company's throat. I would never do something so stupid, Lawrence thought to himself, but then he realized that he had been thinking of it just a moment ago. A large amount of money could cloud anyone's eyes. Those who chose the path of the merchant knew this. You can keep the robe. Hollow's clothing was tossed at Lawrence's bound hands. Lawrence grabbed at the rope with all his strength, somehow sealing away his anger at his betrayal. The fact that they had tied him up meant that he was not going to find himself impaled on a blade immediately. He could not get himself killed for pointless resistance. However, it was plain to see that the men had no intention of letting him live either. They were probably wondering whether to simply leave him in the cold of the forest, where the wolves might come. It was a reasonable question as far as it went. But there was something important the men had overlooked. They thought Hollow was dead. If Lawrence could rejoin her, all kinds of revenge became possible. He could not die here. He had to repay this betrayal. The anger was a stone in his gut, as Lawrence feigned meek resignation. Don't think it doesn't wound me that I can't say we'll meet again. Lawrence's forehead burned at the man's casual speech, but he bore it silently, not looking over his shoulder. It's depressing to think about what happens next. Hey! Another of the Remilio Company men interrupted another of the another of the Remilio Company men, as if to warn of unnecessary chatter. What could possibly be depressing now at this last stage? It was something that Lawrence mustn't hear apparently, even though he was about to die. Come on, let us talk. I can't just keep quiet. You're the same, right? The one being addressed was at a loss for words for a moment. Lawrence ignored his own rage in order to listen. What were they talking about? But that's the girl this guy had with him. Who cares if he hears? It can't be, his heart cried out within him. See, look! The man in front of Lawrence delivered a vicious kick to him. At the same time, another punched his face. Lawrence's head swam from the brutal shock, and when he came, he was lying prostrate on the ground. He couldn't tell whether the blockage on his nose was mud or blood. All he felt was terrible fury that raced through him. His vision sparked from the shock, and he wasn't even sure what happened to his body. But he heard every word that was said. What if we What if you just tie her up like this poor bastard? The wolves will just finish them off for us. Don't be stupid. Who knows what kind of pagan magic she used to get the sheep through that forest unharmed. We could blindfold her, tie both hands, and leave her here. And if they'd still survive, and they'd still survive, and we'd be the ones in trouble. But it's depressing, I'll say that. Won't be able to eat for a while if I lay a hand on the girl, that's for sure. They were clearly talking about Nora. They were talking about killing her. If the Remilio Company's solution to the risk of blackmail was murder, they could not very well let Nora live either. They would probably pass the checkpoint on the way to Ruvenegg and then kill her after handing off the sheep to another shepherd. Nora was the only shepherd whose presence in the area wasn't suspicious. So they could not kill her. So they could not kill her after the checkpoint. Shouldn't we finish off? Shouldn't we finish off this guy? This guy off? What? You wanna do it? Hey, less killing the better. As far as I'm concerned. I'm with you. We've got the horse, so let's go. If we don't hurry, we'll catch it from Mr. Liebert. Their footsteps receded, only to be followed by the sound of horse hooves. After that, all Lawrence could hear was the sound of drizzle. Pathetically, he began to cry. The sin of helplessness. Lawrence squeezed his eyes shut. If only he were strong as Hollow. He would not have had to leave her to face danger alone, and he would not have to be resigned to this betrayal. To say nothing of having to listen while his enemies plotted the murder of a girl he himself had hired. Nora was not like Hollow. She didn't have pagan magic or any special powers. If sliced with a sword, her skin would split and blood would flow. Enoch might be of some help, but it was faint hope. No matter how gallant a dog, he would be helpless in the face of a surprise attack. Lawrence wanted to at least spare Nora this. He thought of her when they had spoken on the hill overlooking Lamtra. She was smarter and tougher than she looked, and she knew her shepherding days were over. She had pinned her hopes on this unusual job. She wanted to become a dressmaker after the severe life of the shepherd. It must have seemed a nearly impossible dream. How much the possibility that it might come to pass must have thrilled her heart. It was, of course, a fool's errand letting one's heart go aflutter at mere hope, but for one's demise to be brought through treachery, that was another matter. Nora would do the job given her. She had to receive her compensation. This was true of Lawrence himself as well. Of course, once he had reunited with Hollow, he had the hope of exacting as much retribution as he wanted. However, Nora's journey would end at the tip of a sword. Using his maddening frustration as fuel, Lawrence forced his prostrate body to move. His hands were still bound behind his back, but by putting his face against the ground, he brought his knees under him to his chest, and in one movement he raised his head and righted himself. Apparently none One nostril was blocked with mud, the other with blood. He snorted violently to clear his nose and then inhaled the cold air to cool his head. Not that his head became any cooler. He stood and began to walk unsteadily. He did not notice that his bound hands were still held Holo's clothing until he came to the spot where the horse had been taken from him. The fire had been kicked apart and scattered, but there was still some red glowing embers. Lawrence left Holo's clothing where it wouldn't get wet and took a deep breath. Then he sat down very carefully next to the largest ember. Checking his orientation to it several times, he paused to ready himself. Throwing himself down, Lawrence pressed his bound wrist against the hot coal. The rope crackled as it burned. A terrible heat assaulted his wrists. He squeezed his eyes shut and clenched his jaw to withstand the pain. Next moment, his hands were suddenly free. He had loosened the bonds. Lawrence stood immediately and looked at his wrist. There were a few burns, but nothing serious. He was not as stupid to grab the nearest handy stick to go chasing after his betrayers. He knew that waiting for Holo was the best and only option. A simple traveling merchant was powerless. A merchant did not have pride the way a knight or a townsperson did. He was prepared to lick anyone's boot if it meant turning a profit. So whence came the feeling of humiliation? Lawrence stood rooted to the spot and looked up at the sky. The leaves on the trees shielded him from the rain and made him think of whatever cosmic force it was allowed him to crawl in the dirt. Think of whatever cosmic force it was that allowed him only to crawl in the dirt. He couldn't bear it and looked down. His eyes landed upon the robe Holo had worn. Once again he shed tears of his own helplessness. A tearful reunion, eh? Eventually, unable to contain himself, Lawrence had to run through the rain and encountered Holo as just as he was running out of breath. Holo was in her human form, uninjured and looking much the same as when they had parted ways. The knees of her trousers were dirty. Perhaps she had tripped somewhere along the way. You look terrible, she said with an amused smile. We are betrayed. I'm not so naive as to think of you. I'm not so naive as to think you saw that and fell, said Holo with a sigh. I cannot say it didn't occur to me. They were from the company, yes? Her lack of surprise or shock suggested that she had vaguely anticipated betrayal, but since the entire plan was founded on mutual trust, she did not easily suggest the possibility. For Lawrence's part, even if he had been told in advance, he would not necessarily have known what to do. It was an unmistakable reality that nothing could happen without the Remilio Company's cooperation. Wallace smiled briefly and drew close to Lawrence, sniffing as she took his hands. She seemed to notice the burns. Honestly, I would have found you soon enough. You didn't have to do this. She twitched her nose again, then struck her hand onto Lawrence's coat, pulling her robe out. Ola seemed surprised and wiped her face against the cloth. Her drizzle-soaked face was much improved. She giggled. You're a strange one, protecting my clothes with your life. Ola's tail bristled in contrast to her delighted expression upon seeing the folded robe. When she looked back at Lawrence, she still smiled, and he could have melted into her burning red eyes. There's something I need to say. I must be completely frank, she said, her fangs showing when she flashed a grin. I may have to kill someone. She said, then continued before Lawrence could interrupt. I thought that if this plan didn't go well, I'd no longer be able to travel with you. The thought made me dreadfully lonely, thus I bore it. I let things go by peaceably. I came along with you and I put up with things because I thought we'd soon be sipping hot potato soup in front of a fireplace. I am the wise wolf of Yoitsu, Hollow. I can't forget the pride of a youngster if need be. Lawrence looked down at the mud on Hollow's knees. It had been no normal wolf in the forest. It had not been after the sheep. There were few possibilities. A territorial dispute? Given that, the actions Hollow took to let things go by peaceably became clearer and clearer. A wise wolf would never stumble clumsily over a stone, dirtying her knees. No, listen. That was all well and good. I'm Hollow the Wise Wolf. If I am made to act like a mere dog, I shall still not be angry. But what is this? This soaked mouse standing in front of me, face swollen, covered in mud. Has my companion been so foolish as to trip and fall, and with burns on his wrist? Oh, indeed, before me this fine fool who doesn't give a second thought to his own appearance, but protects my robe against the rain with his life? A dunce indeed. I have no idea what to do with such unbelievable soft-heartedness. Hollow gave her whole speech in one long breath, then inhaled deeply as she rubbed her eyes. Well then, I take it we're off to Reuvenhagen, she said, suddenly back to her normal self. Her arms and legs were covered with scratches and trembled. Lawrence didn't think it was because of the cold. This was Hollow when she was truly angry. Burp. If we go now, we can enter the city under the cover of darkness. The Master always takes responsibility for betrayal. This is the truth of the world. Hollow thrust her robe back at Lawrence, then untied the opening of the leather pouch around her neck and popped a few grains of wheat into her mouth. There was no hesitation. Wait! There's Liebert and Nora, interjected Lawrence, now that he had finally had the opportunity to speak. Hollow's eyebrows shot up. Think it through. Betrayal demands revenge. Sin must have punishment. But plunging in without thinking will give us no satisfaction. We can't be satisfied until we have taken everything from them. Don't you agree? Consider, if we attack the lot that came for you, dealing with the gold afterward becomes difficult. But we'll go first to the Master's house and make him good and sorry. Then strike at the ones who so happily betrayed you. And then we have to butcher the sheep. Take the gold and go wherever we may please. I dare say it's the best plan. Despite her anger, Hollow's mind was clear and agile as ever. Her plan has almost entirely eclipsed Lawrence. However, there was a reason he had to abandon this excellent plan. I feel the same way, but we must first get to Liebert, and quickly. You have a better plan? Asked Hollow after gulping down a few grains of wheat. Her expression was unreadable, and Lawrence got a feeling that if he misspoke here, he would feel the full force of whatever swirled behind that mask. Nonetheless, he could not abandon Nora. The Remilio Company plans to murder Nora. Horo smiled thinly. Yes, and those fools planned to kill you as well. Yet you lived. She may, too may survive, don't you think? If you go save her, she will be definitely safe. Is that so? Lawrence found himself faintly irritated at Holo's mischievous look. Why was she acting like this? Time was short. If Nora and Liebert ran through the night, they might make it through the checkpoint on Ruvenhagen before dawn. And if it came to that, Nora would be killed shortly thereafter. The probability was high. You could defeat 100 men in a flash, could you not? Asked Lawrence impatiently, but Holo only shook her head slowly. That is not the problem. Then what is the problem? Lawrence wanted to say. I am a wolf. The girl is a shepherd. We are our eternal antagonists. For a moment, Lawrence wondered why Holo was dragging that out now, but then he realized something important. If Holo attacked Liebert and the others in front in her wolf form, it was quite possibly that Nora would try to protect them. In that case, there was a risk that Liebert would kill Nora. So there was a risk that Liebert would kill Nora. So could Holo explain that if she was there for the Remilio men, would Nora even accept that? If she didn't, Holo would wind up playing the villain. Even in the best of times, Holo hated shepherds. It was obvious that she did not want to go to such lengths to save Nora, and Lawrence couldn't force her to. I know there's nothing in it for you, far from it, in fact. But I cannot ask this of you. An innocent person is about to die, and I can't just turn the other way. Holo looked askance irritably as Lawrence tried to convince her. She was the only one who could save Nora. I'll owe you some thanks, of course. Holo twitched one ear and looked at him. What sort of thanks? As long as you don't say anything like, in exchange for her life, I'll give you whatever I can, said Lawrence, trying to strike out the possibility of Holo making such a demand. Upon hearing his words, Holo's face turned severe. She had probably been planning to do just that. Please, you're the only one. Holo's face stayed as irritated as ever, as she lazily waved her sodden tail with discontent. She held her leather pouch in her hand and folded her arms, exhaling widely into the cold air. Holo. Lawrence knew there was a limit to what he could do. Moreover, Holo had endured humiliation in order that his gold smuggling could proceed. She had dirtied her knees and been made, she said, to act like a dog. He could not imagine any number of awful appearances that might have been forced on her. Then, having endured that humiliation, he finds that her partner has been betrayed and been made to look like a fool. He couldn't criticize her for, and was already thankful that she was willing to assume her wolf form to strike at the Remilio Company. Asking her for any more was the height of selfishness. Holo exhaled a puff of air. She smiled, looking almost resigned. Come now, don't use that voice, she said, heaving a sigh. Here, take this. Also, I suppose I'd best take off my clothes. It would be troublesome to arrange some new ones. You'll do it? There is a condition, she said, as she undid the sash and held her trousers up. Her expression was unreadable. Lawrence gulped and waited. You'll understand if I don't guarantee the lives of those who bother me. If Nora took Hollow for an enemy and protected Liebert and the company, she would be spared no mercy, in other words. He couldn't tell if she was joking or not. No, she was surely serious. Hollow had spoken without particularly looking at Lawrence. Her breath was neither fast nor slow. Lawrence mustered all of his business cunning in response. Very well, I trust you. Puffs of white vapor appeared as Hollow laughed, as if giving in. You've gotten quite clever. Exactly what sort of troublesome fellow am I traveling with? She shook her head lightly and quickly took off her blouse and trousers. And she kicked off her shoes roughly and, after collecting them, tossed them at Lawrence. What? No words of admiration yet? She said, putting her hand to her hip and turning around as if looking over her shoulder. It was a small price to pay. It's a magnificent tale, Lawrence said. It was a bit monotone, but I suppose it'll do. Hollow turned to face him. Now then, be so kind as to close your eyes. She had no problems with being nude, but evidently she did not want him to witness her transformation. Lawrence had no desire to oppose Hollow on this. His feelings on the matter were complicated as well, as he well knew from the Patio incident. He closed his eyes and waited. Soon there was a murmuring sort of rumble, like a great throng of mice running, and it was followed by the sound of something growing larger. Then he heard the shifting of something huge, wavering to and fro in the air. And finally, the heavy footfalls of a large animal. Lawrence felt a hot breath on his face. When he opened his eyes, it was a gigantic mouth directly in front of him. If you'd flinched, I was thinking of eating your head first. Well, it is fairly frightening, answered Lawrence. Honestly, as Hollow's red tinged irises seemed to stare right through him. He trusted her after all. Perhaps she smiled a bit with her well-fanged mouth. There was a slight snarl. Shall I carry you in my mouth, or on my back? Spare me your mouth, please. You might find it surprisingly comfortable. I might be tempted by the warmth and find myself in your stomach. Come, on my back now. Grab onto my fur. It won't hurt. Hold as tightly as you need. Olive's body had a mysterious heat to it. It was like standing by a campfire. Lawrence faltered a bit at her intimidating aura, which seemed to make even the rain move aside. But once he had roughly wrapped up her cloths and slung them under his arm, he did as he was told, and grabbing her fur, climbed on top the great wolf. She had an animalistic scent to her, unlike a human, but it was distinctly hollow nonetheless. If you fall, I'll snatch you up in my jaws. I'll make sure not to. It could tell that she smiled. You know. What? I truly hate shepherds. For a moment Lawrence didn't know why she bothered repeating this, but when he realized it was simply her true feelings, he pointed one thing out. Nora knows that whether this job succeeds or fails, she'll have to give up give up shepherding. Lawrence felt a low rumbling. Hollow was growling. By way of thanks, you'd best buy me more honeyed peach preserves than I can possibly eat. Then Lawrence was assaulted by a terrible sensation that he was about to slip off as beneath him, Hollow's huge body began to run. He held onto her fur for dear life, pressing himself down, desperate not to fall off the wise wolf, who accelerated with shocking force. The wind in his ears sounded like a rushing, flooding river. Flooding. But he also felt something else from the huge body he had felt. A huge body that had left him so terrified when he had seen first. It filled him with an indistinct warmth. Hollow's endurance was infinite, and she could run faster than any horse. But even so, they were unable to put the forest behind them until the sun was beginning to set. Her feet bit into the earth, and the landscape grew dimmer, as though candles were being put out one by one. The rain was relentless, and Hollow's breath trailed behind him like a cloud. Soon they found the road to Ruvenhagen. Hollow turned right with no hesitation and gathered still more speed. Occasionally, while on her back, Lawrence could hear a sound distinct from her breathing. Perhaps it was her growling. She said she might kill someone. At the time, Lawrence had thought she was planning to stop just short of killing anyone. If not, there was no might about it. There was not a human alive who could survive Hollow's claws and fangs. Hey! Hollow's voice came Hollow's voice. There was too much tension in her voice for it to be idle chatter. We'll soon be upon them. I don't mind if you stay back a bit, but you might not stay on my back, but you might not like it. I'm going to jump clear over them. I'll crouch down right afterwards so you can jump off then. Understood. If you dilly-dally, I'll shake you right off. Lawrence couldn't respond, and Hollow plunged ahead, accelerating with a terrifying speed. He wondered if this is what it would be like to ride an arrow shot from a bow, when he heard Hollow take a deep breath. Then it echoed, a thunderous howl. Suddenly, the steady pounding of Hollow's stride ceased. They were flying. The only way to come close to the sensation would be to jump a horse off a cliff, but terrifyingly, the feeling lasted. Lawrence clung to Hollow's body as they fell for an agonizingly long time. Now! Lawrence's mind cried out, wondering when the landing would come. When he finally felt the impact on Hollow's feet striking the ground, Lawrence wasn't sure if he was still alive. He was afraid he would be flung off from the sudden deceleration. When Hollow suddenly wheeled around to crouch low. Off you go, she said quietly. Lawrence remembered what he had been told before. The terror of the leap had not faded, but he managed to climb off Hollow's back. and made it to the ground without falling. There was a tiny moment of relief, then Holo got to her feet. "Leave the rest to me," she said, and dashed off. Lawrence scrambling to follow her. Holo leapt into her hunting grounds with a twinkling, and despite the gathering gloom, Lawrence could clearly see the confusion caused by the giant wolf appearing in her prey's midst. There were close to 20 people. The Remilio Company men raised a cry, and Lawrence somehow saw that Nora was among them. They had made it in time. Holo stood in the middle of the maelstrom. Some of the men brandished long spears, but they might as well have been waving white flags. With the spear tips pointed high, they flourished the weapons uselessly back and forth. The extent of the disarray was obvious. In the middle of all that, something that looked like a ball of mud would occasionally be sent flying. It was difficult to tell in the darkness, but it seemed to be people. Lawrence could see their hands flap wildly as they searched for the ground that had suddenly disappeared. If Holo had been seriously striking people with her paws, they would have surely been dead, so perhaps she was batting them aside on purpose. One man was flung into the air, now two, and the long swords that were hurled at Holo in panic made high keening sounds as they were deflected away. With the darkness beginning to take control, the swords were hid away from Holo so high and hard that Lawrence's eyes could not follow them. He got close enough to Holo to hear her breathing before the swords started to strike the earth near him. Lawrence could tell they had been hurled quite high because the swords came down with such force that they had been buried up to their hilts in the ground. The Remilio Company had bet everything on this operation and had dispatched too many people to kill Lawrence and Nora. However, the majority of them now lay unconscious, sprawled on the ground like stunning frogs, occasionally trampled on by the panicking sheep that ran around in circles. "Protect the sheep and the shepherd. Protect the sheep and the shepherd!" Lawrence drew a sharp breath at the voice. It was Liebert. He looked and saw that the young manager was one of the few taking rational action. Keeping his panicking horse in check, Liebert waved the spear and shouted orders from a slight remove. His timid nature while traveling with Lawrence and the rest had been apparently an act to get them to lower their guard. If the man was cunning and careful enough to carry off this intricate betrayal, he was certainly capable of that much. "Protect the shepherd! Run! Run!" And Liebert called out again. Even if he had planned to kill Nora eventually, she was critical for letting the gold through this checkpoint. Despite the resolute orders and the brave attempts of some Remilio men to carry them out, in the face of the attack by Holo, obviously designed to smash their hopes, many men cried out and took flight. Holo ignored the stout few who were still brandishing their swords or spears and chased after the panicked. It was a devil's tactic. Once Holo pounced one of them from behind, she would roll him over, then send the poor cowering fellow flying with a flick of her nose. This all happened so quickly that it seemed like it could not last much longer. The number of men still standing had been steadily winnowed. Now it was just Liebert on his horse, a petrified Nora and Enoch. violently, valiantly trying to protect her. Hollow shook her great head. Something splattered. Rain, or sweat, or blood. Shepherd, protect me, protect me! Liebert cried out, clutching his chest, but it was unclear whether that was because his heart was on the verge of failure or to protect the gold in his coat. Liebert screamed, looking not unlike the statues of sinners suffering in hell that decorated the church. But by some miracle he controlled his horse and stayed behind Nora, along with her sheep. She may have been a shepherd, but Nora was a girl of delicate build. The display made Lawrence nauseous, and Liebert had planned to both kill him and the girl. Just as Nora was about to crumple from terror, the shepherdess seemed to remember her duty. With a certain hand, she raised her staff aloft, ringing the bell. At his end, Enoch crouched low, as ready to receive directions. Hollow looked at Nora head on, lowering her huge body like a loaded catapult. Lawrence's breath caught. Hollow was serious at this rate. Hollow was serious. At this rate, Nora could be killed. Between the darkness and the sudden confusion caused by Hollow's appearance, no one had noticed Lawrence from a small distance away. He thought if he identified himself, then at least Nora would recognize the giant wolf as Hollow. There was a risk of tipping Liebert off, but Lawrence was trying to think realistically. There was no way that Hollow would let him leave unharmed. Lawrence was about to make his presence known. When he was about to shout when... Shepherd, I'll give you 3 Lumione to protect me. In the midst of her fright, having raised her staff mostly by reflex, Nora's expression suddenly changed. 300 Lumione could do that to a person. Nora silenced her bell. Her face began to fill with resolve. Liebert, with his snake-like cunning, seemed to sense it. He turned his horse's head around and began to gallop away at full speed. Lawrence cried out in a strangled voice. Nora, true to her profession, swung her staff. It was too late. The realization exploded in Lawrence's head as time seemed to slow down. Enoch and Hollow, though their sizes were vastly different, assumed the same posture, like arrows on a bow moment before taking flight. Nora's staff was still pointing straight at Hollow. Lawrence thought he heard a bell ring quietly. Ting! Lawrence shouted something, but whether it was Hollow's name or Nora's, he didn't even know. He didn't even know if it even was a name. His straining eyes watched Enoch and Hollow for the barest hint of movement. Thus he saw the instant when the gallant sheepdog and the huge godlike wolf pounced. He was sure in the next instant he would see Enoch's body. He was sure that in the next instant he would see Enoch's body ripped through by Hollow's massive claws before those same claws were turned on his mistress. Then those paws would stretch farther out to render their judgment in order on another unworthy existence, turning it into a mass of gore not even fit to be butchered. Regret. Lawrence didn't know what or how he regretted, only that regret filled his soul now. And then, Enoch, wait! Those words were like some magical signal, restoring time to its normal flow. Hollow's huge form leapt through the air like a stone hurled from a catapult, clearing both the dog and his mistress and landing among the sheep, which scattered chaotically. Immediately upon landing, Hollow sprung forward after the fleeing Liebert, whose desire for money had reduced him to a swine. When the man turned back and saw the wolf pursuing him, Lawrence caught a glimpse of his pathetic face. A short scream tore the air. It was soon silenced. Hollow ran lightly for a few more paces, then stopped. Nora still held Enoch. However, Lawrence could not tell that it was from fright that she clung to him. Somehow, Nora knew. She either knew that the giant wolf was hollow, or that it wasn't trying to attack them, but in either case, she knew not to let Enoch give chase. She had cast aside her staff, something no shepherd ever did, and desperately held Enoch to stop him. That wasn't fear. Nora! Lawrence shouted and ran towards her, still worried that she was hurt. Still restraining Enoch, Nora looked up, shocked, and was doubly so upon seeing Lawrence. She then turned slowly to Hollow, this time unsurprised. Her aspect suggested that she both did and did not understand. The emotion in Lawrence's chest practically exploded from his mouth. I'm glad you're alright. Alright. Nora could see that the giant wolf wolf responsible for all this was still unhurt. So she had no idea how to react to these words. She looked to Lawrence with a dazed expression on her face, overwhelmed. The wolf is Hollow, my companion. I mean, Nora smiled awkwardly. She probably thought it was some kind of joke. She gave a little gasp as Hollow came bounding up to them. A pair of legs protruded from her mouth. You didn't kill him? Lawrence himself had a certain homicidal urge when he had seen Liebert use Nora as a shield. If it had been up to Lawrence, he would have killed the man. Given the legs dangling from Hollow's mouth, the matter would seem to be settled, but instead of replying, Hollow shook her head slightly and let the man drop to the ground. Soaked with saliva, Liebert fell with an unpleasant splat. I thought about swallowing him, I'll admit. Hollow seemed to smile, but gold doesn't agree with my stomach. She sniffed lightly and inclined her chin towards Liebert. Take the gold, she seemed to say. I think it was in his coat. Ugh, he's soaked, Lawrence complained when a huge snout poked him. He begrudgingly peeled back Liebert's warm, wet clothes and easily found the bag of gold. There it is. A genuine article, he said the genuine article, he said upon opening the bag and seeing the gold grains inside. Nora, he said, tossing the bag to the shepherdess. Hollow gave the Lawrence an aggravated look, which he ignored. Job's still not done. You're the one who has to get that gold into the city. The massive wolf heaved a huge sigh. Surprised, Nora glanced at Hollow, but then back to Lawrence. But how are you still alive? Lawrence gave a pained grimace. After meeting up with his comrades, Liebert had sent men back into the forest to, quote-unquote, save Lawrence. But those men came back, had returned without him, which meant Lawrence and Hollow had surely died. Lawrence tried to think of where to begin his explanation of events, when he felt the air stir and, looking over his shoulder, saw Hollow raise her front leg and bring it down hard. There was a oh no, there's an there was a loud crack like a thick tree branch breaking, followed by an ear-splitting shriek that echoed in the darkness. It seemed excessive to Lawrence, but also well deserved. After the shriek died down, Liebert, whose left leg had just been broken by Holo's forepaw, flapped his mouth wordlessly, eyes open. Good evening, Mr. Liebert. And how fare you tonight? Wha- wha- How are you? Holo. Honey dyed peach preserves. As if by magic, those words dispelled Holo's reinvigorated anger, and she reluctantly took her paw off of the man's broken leg. Mr. Liebert, would you be so kind to explain to Nora how while you were getting dressed, uh, how while you were getting dressed, you, shall we say, got the buttons wrong? Please, please. Liebert wiped the sweat from his forehead, and for a minute his merchant sense showed past the terror and pain. It was the shrewd face of a merchant who understood the situation and was trying to discern how to save his own life. Mr. Liebert, it, it wasn't me. It was Remilio's orders. I told him not to do it. I told him betrayal would call down God's wrath. I swear. I was against it. As you can see, this is no ordinary wolf. Think of it as a representative of Almighty God. In other words, lies will not avail you. Liebert's mouth snapped shut and looked up at Holo with despair in his eyes. Slowly, very slowly, Holo's white breath emerged from between her teeth. I thought we were paying too much compensation. Remilio too. At this rate, we'd use all the profit paying our debts, and have nothing to keep. Remilio told me about it. I had to. I had no other choice. You understand, don't you? After all, we're both merchants. After he was cut off when Lawrence punched him in the nose. I'm nothing like you. Ola laughed heartedly after taking paw of the again unconscious Liebert. So that's how it is. The Remilio company had planned to kill you, Nora. I swear this to you, they betrayed us. Nora's expression was blank, but the situation seemed to be slowly sinking into her head nonetheless. She looked up. Slowly at Lawrence, but, but, what about the wolves in the forest? That was something else, interjected Holo, causing Nora to give a small yelp of surprise. Holo's voice carried well, after all. I am Holo, the wise wolf of Yoitze. What was in the forest was nothing more than a brat whose only redeeming feature was its sense of territory. I have prudence enough to avoid a pointless fight over something like that. Holo. Nora listened to Holo with an half incredulous expression. Then Miss Holo then smiled helplessly as she slowly let go of Enoch. I don't know why, Miss Holo, but somehow when you say it, I kind of believe you. Incidentally, your dog was never smitten with me. He simply realized my true form. I thought I should let you know. What? Said Nora, surprised, at which point Enoch gave a single angry bark. Now then, Nora, back to the issue at hand, said Lawrence. He felt bad about not changing the subject. Changing the subject yet again, but the affair was not yet settled. The gold was still in transit, and Lawrence's debt was yet unpaid. There's also the issue about what to do about the Remilio company. We're in the middle of a kind of storm right now. However, by the grace of God, somehow we recovered the gold. If Liebert is to be believed, it's worth 600 limione. However, if we can bring it into Ruvenhagen and sell it to a broker, we should get close to 10 times that. 6,000 limione. Nora seemed to quill at such huge figures, which were so big that even Lawrence had trouble wrapping his head around them. 6,000 is far more than we could possibly take receipt for. And even without facing that danger, we have 600 in hand right now. However, however, while it is true that the Remilio company's fault, it's the Remilio's company's fault that the plan has been more eventful than anybody would have liked. It's also true that without their investment, we would have never been able to buy the gold. And if we take the gold and run, we will be left ruined, bankrupt immediately. Thus, Holo nudged the side of Lawrence's face with her nose, and not in playful fashion. Lawrence understood what she was trying to do. Thus, I proposed the following. Now hold! Holo began, her tone displeased, but Lawrence would not yield. Holo, we do not live in a fairy tale world. We cannot simply take our revenge on those who have betrayed us and say, the end. We have to live after this, and taking revenge for betrayal only invites more revenge. Well then, are you going to tell me you'd kill the entire ruined company? In the end, I don't want the bread to I buy tomorrow to have been paid for in blood. There are many ways to end this, but if we want to have a life tomorrow, we have to choose to do so. Holo's amber eyes closed. She looked away. If it weren't for you, I'd be freezing to death by the forest right now. I'm well aware that if you hadn't been there, all would have been lost, and all would have been lost. And I thank you for hearing my plea, but enough, enough. I say, my travel companion is tiresome beyond words, said Holo. Said Holo, hitting Lawrence's head slightly with her chin. It hurts, but if this satisfied her selfishness, it was a small price. It was a small price to pay. Then, here's what I'll have you do. You may as well. Let me just say this. I'll carry out whatever duties your undoubtedly tiresome plan asks of me, so you may as well ask away. Lawrence smiled, thankful beyond words, and took a deep breath before turning back to Nora. Sorry to keep you waiting. Here's what I propose to do. Having listened to the strange exchange between Holo and Lawrence, Nora straightened herself and looked up. I'd like you to decide whether or not to bring the gold into Ruvenhagen. What? It was the obvious question. Without any further risk, she had 600 Lumione on hand. Of course, 6,000 was unimaginable gain over that, but it would mean risking her life again. However, if you bring it into Ruvenhagen, the huge profit will save both us and the Remilio company. This Nora let slip a small. Oh. On the other hand, if you decide to take it, then all of these fallen men, among with their families in Ruvenhagen, and the other remnants of the company, will all glimpse hell. Some of them will not be spared its wrath, but in their hearts they will bear a grudge against three demons. That is to say, me, Hollow, and you, Nora. Even even for someone who lived by traveling, being the object of such animosity from so many people could make life far more dangerous. Business consists consisted of exchanging between people. The location of Lawrence and Hollow and Nora would eventually be found, and swords put to their throats. There was another important point to make. Of course, if we flee to some foreign land with a foreign tongue, we can live as though nothing happened. But even living without fear of revenge, suppose. But even living without fear of revenge, suppose you came across a slave with a familiar face being whipped like a workhorse. Would you be able to sleep that night? Lawrence paused, allowing the words to sink in. However, I will have Remilio Company make amends. Hello grinned unpleasantly. We're headed there next. For your part, Nora, please make your decision by tomorrow morning. If you decide to bring the gold into Ruvenhagen, we'll meet at the plaza where we first discussed this. I'll go into the city first. Secure a trustworthy butcher and wait by the eastern gate for one day. If you decide not to bring it in, let us meet in Poroson. This plan did, of course, leave room for another betrayal. Nora could take all the gold and set off for some other town. For all of them to live without regret, though, it would be the best if she brought the gold into Ruvenhagen. So the Remilio company could be saved and the money divided equitably. Lawrence had to consider what to do if Nora were caught at the checkpoint, though. Without exception, gold smugglers were executed in the plaza, so he would just have Hollow rescue her if need be. Hollow had promised to do as he asked, after all, no matter how tiresome the task. Lawrence wasn't particularly trying to give Nora the time to think, but in any case, while waiting for her reply, he went among the unconscious Remilio men and tied them up. He had no rope, so he used the sleeves of their coats. Even if the men cooperated to undo the knots, none of them seemed to be in any condition to do anything strenuous. Well then, Nora, we'll meet again, said Lawrence. Once he finished binding the men and had Nolo knock out a few were regaining consciousness. He didn't say that to try and persuade her of anything in particular. It was merely to ascertain her trust in bringing about a favorable outcome. The moon shone vaguely through the thick clouds. Mr. Lawrence? He stopped as she called his name. We'll meet again. He looked over his shoulder to see her holding her staff. We will, he said, and we'll be rich. Nora smiled and nodded. Inek barked and began to round up the sheep. Well now. After they walked for a while, Lawrence started to think about riding on Hollow's back. But she had apparently already anticipated that and spoke up just in time to cut him off. What? He said, just slightly irritated. He was sure she had chosen that exact moment for that purpose. Might I hear the truth now? Hollow looked at him evenly with her large eyes. Lies would not avail him. He had told Liebert the same thing. Lawrence was aware of that and of the pained grimace that distorted his face. Let me hold up pretense a bit longer. No. Looking at her happily wagging tail, Lawrence knew she would keep asking until he relented. He quickly gave up deception. That's not enough gold. Oh? There's no way that's 600 Limione. It's 100 at best. Your share would be used up by just paying your debt. If she doesn't smuggle it in, there'll be no profit at all. The tip of her tail, big tail, brushed against the back of her neck. She slapped it. He slapped it away. She growled playfully. The Remilio company must be well up against the wall. They must have scraped together 100 Limione, hoping just to get by. Hoping just to get by on that. Of course, they knew. They knew from the start they have to pay us enough to keep our mouths shut. But that's precisely why they got on board with the plan with us in the first place. And yet Lawrence's position was such that he had no choice but to trust and rely on that same company. Hmm. Still, that was certainly a skillful excuse you gave her. You're like unto a saint. It was most sincere. Willow chuckled through her nose and then stopped and crouched down. Get on. What? No more interrogation? I tire of your foolishness. Narrowing her amber eyes, she nudged him with her muzzle. Oh. Mm-hmm. It was but a light touch, yet Lawrence nearly stumbled and fell through. Though his fear though his fear of Hollow's wolf form was by now entirely gone. Still, we're not just saving the Remilio company out of charity. Oh? Lawrence grabbed onto Hollow's fur and brought his legs up. No, we're doing it to make more money for ourselves. He swung his legs quickly over her back. More money, eh? I cannot say I follow you. Merchants can convert all sorts of things into money. I have to be of some occasional use. At first he thought she was teasing him, but Hollow's laugh was genuine. I look forward to observing your skill, sir. Hollow got to her feet and began to walk, soon breaking into a run. The golden moon was occasionally visible in the dark sky. Perhaps owing to the rain that had fallen since the moon, the Ruvenhagen night was exceptionally quiet. There must be some kind of problem, right? Like when you've forgotten to put salt in the soup. Lawrence knew only too well that merchants were people who, no matter the circumstances, lived by telling lies. However, trust was important even among liars. Merchants were strange creatures indeed. Lawrence pondered this. I don't know what Liebert said. I'm sure it sounded like heaven's own truth. As if he were confessing before an altar. But it was a lie. He lies about everything. I've been thinking about firing him, I swear. The man's voice was hoarse and difficult to hear through the emotion. But this was no delicate business in negotiation. As long as Lawrence could understand the gist, it was good enough. Mr. Remilio. Yeah! And Remilio gave a sort of cry. He gave a sort of cry because his head was firmly clamped between Hollow's jaws. And he felt her increased the pressure just a bit. Lawrence had Lawrence and Hollow were fortunate that he had been alone in office, waiting for his employees to return. Just a moment ago, Hollow had jumped over the city walls in with unbelievable ease. Lawrence had planned to re-enter the city with Hollow in human form and simply claim they had been waylaid by bandits, but Hollow could see any sense of presence on the other side of the wall. Could sense any presence on the other side of the wall. Said simply, "It's safe," and cleared it in a single leap. It had been so easy that Lawrence wondered if they could have avoided all this trouble in the first place and smuggled gold in themselves. They entered the city unseen, and once Hollow had temporarily returned to her human form, stole quietly, uh, stole quietly into the Remilio company. Remilio had been expecting the return of his men, so when he saw Hollow and Lawrence, he made quite a face. He was now tied up on the floor, head trapped between Hollow's terrifying teeth, looking as though he might die from terror. It seemed prudent to let Remilio see Hollow's true form, but it seemed prudent to let Remilio see Hollow's true form, but he and Lawrence both shared the secret of gold smuggling. Remilio wanted to go to the church with the revelation. To go to the church with the revelation. Let him. There was a mountain of circumstantial evidence. No merchant would speak for his opponent's weakness when his opponent could easily do the same to him. Also, letting Hollow terrify Remilio would make her feel better, and the overwhelming terror would discourage the master from trying to exact revenge on them later. Unsurprisingly, the results had been immense. The jaws that now hold your head between the teeth are the jaws of truth, my friend. If you lie, they will know. Also, this wolf is hungry from being made to run all night. I hear if you lie, your head may just be devoured. Hollow's fangs squeezed just slightly harder against Remilio's temple. He couldn't even scream anymore. All right, Mr. Remilio. I know know that I have not returned to take revenge for your betrayal. I've come to talk business. A bit of light returned to Remilio's eyes at the words business, perhaps realizing that business was about making deals, and if a deal could be made there was a possibly that he would not die here. Our negotiations will begin now. Feel free to lie in your interest as much as you wish. However, the wolf here is far more discerning than I can see the hidden meaning behind your words. If you do anything clumsy, you may wind up a head shorter. Are we clear? With his head stuck between Hollow's jaws, Remilio couldn't very well nod, but he tried to. And that was good enough. Then, let's begin, said Lawrence frankly. In the event that we succeed in gold smuggling, might I ask you to purchase it from us at 500 Lumione? Remilio's eyes were literally dots. We are still accomplices in smuggling. Surely you didn't think we'd come back to take revenge of you after making off with the gold? The salt and pepper-haired Remilio nodded like a chastened child, at which Lawrence grinned bitterly. Well, I won't say there's no chance of that, but no, I don't think so. But if we don't talk about what to do when we succeed, well, We might wind up disagreeing, mightn't we? Hollow chuckled deep in her throat, causing Remilio's head to quiver along with her mouth. His face tensed in a nervous grin. So, I'll say it again. Might I ask you to purchase the gold from us at 500 Lumione? Remilio's face was distorted with despair. He knew how much the gold bought in Lamtra was really worth. I can't possibly do. Of course, I don't expect you to. I don't expect it all in cash up front. Let's see. Perhaps you could write me an IOU? In that at that moment, the master of the Remilio company showed the intelligence that had got him into this position. He made a pained expression, and when he understood that Lawrence was saying that, he begged for mercy. And begged for mercy. 500 Lumione. It's simply too much? Well, in that case, I'll just take whatever you've hidden here and sell the gold to someone else. Lawrence exchanged a look with Holo and then added, also, I'll let that demon here have your life. Holo hated being called a god, but she apparently didn't mind being called a demon. Her tail swished through the air, and she panted dramatically. All expression drained rapidly from Remilio's face. If Lawrence's guess was right, it meant Remilio would now do whatever he asked. You see, Mr. Remilio, I don't think it's fair to lose everything because of a single failure. We can't perfectly predict every price drop, can we? So I want to give you another chance, but I want you to be grateful for it. And I want that to take the form of 500 Lumione. You've built a wonderful company with a magnificent loading dock in a city like this. If you think in terms of decades, surely 500 is a bargain. Remilio's eyes opened wide, and after that moment he began to cry. If he could rebuild his business, paying 500 Lumione back over the course of 10 years was far from an unreasonable proposition. A traveling merchant was no match for a trading company in that regard. Perhaps those tears were from the prospect of managing a revived company. So, you'll write the note then? Holo. Upon hearing her name, Holo sighed and reluctantly released Remilio, nudging his head with the tip of her nose. Lawrence untied the rope bound Remilio and continued. The terms will be yearly installments over 10 years. The first will be 10 Lumione, and the last will be 100. You understand, yes? It meant that the debt would increase every year. Added all up to... Let's see. Added all up to... it came up to 550 Lumione, but that was still an excellent interest rate. Remilio could get his company running successfully again. It would not be difficult to manage. You can write it out on that desk. Remilio nodded and accepted Lawrence's hand to get to his feet. His feet were still tied, so he tottered over to the desk and said, should this be payable to the Remilio company? Began Remilio, turning around. Lawrence smiled and answered, the Rowan Trade Guild. Remilio grinned almost sadly, realizing he would never be able to run from this debt. If Lawrence held the loan personally, then as the years passed and Remilio gained strength, he could get revenge or default on the repayment. Also, Lawrence dreaded the thought of having to return every year to the people who had wronged him in order to demand his money. And more important still was the Remilio's company's current utter lack of assets. No matter how many IOUs he might hold, Lawrence would see none of this money for a year, even if the debt he had originally owed to the company was now gone. The profits from the gold smuggling might be used up compensating Nora and paying obligations for the Remilio company's recovery. In the worst case, let's see. In the worst case, Nora might not even get her consideration. But all those problems were solved by having the trading guild to which Lawrence was attached hold the loan. By selling the IOU to the Rowan Trading Guild relatively cheaply, you could cut ties with the Remilio company and convert 10 years of repayment into immediate cash. Also, defaulting on the loan held by the Trading Guild was like declaring war on another city. The Remilio company would never dare to default. You were a formidable man. Not as formidable as the wolf, Lawrence answered smoothly. The wolf found the joke funnier than anyone. Now, all we need to do is pray the smuggling succeeds. Epilogue. Let me see. Give me a second. I'll read this. It can't be that long. Afterward, things were busy. First, Lawrence and Holo had to borrow changes of clothes from the Remilio company, while the dirt and blood were washed from their own clothes. While those clothes dried, Lawrence took the IOU to the Rowan Trading Guild, leaving Holo, who said she was hungry, at a late-night tavern. Apparently, it was Lawrence's job to take care of the details. Lawrence was greeted heartily by the members of the Trading Guild who had gathered there to drink after the end of the business day. He endured many vulgar questions about the wound on his face before finally reaching Jacob. It wouldn't have been at all strange for people from the Remilio company to come beating down the door demanding repayment, but neither they nor Lawrence had been seen. Jacob had probably been worried sick ever since Lawrence's death had been incurred. Unsurprisingly, Jacob's first reaction upon seeing Lawrence's face was to was to angrily give his skull some sound rapping. But then his face split in a tearful smile, and he drew his arms wide, relieved that Lawrence was safe. Lawrence turned the IOU over to Jacob, who could probably guess in broad sense what had happened. He brought a purse full of seldom seen gold Lumione coins out from within the guild and bought the IOU on the spot. Of course, now there was a merchant who had entered his term of service. It had been entirely possible that the gold smuggling would not succeed. In which case, the Remilio company's physical assets and accounts receivable would have been sold off to pay its debts. Normally, when a company failed, its assets were liquidated and divided proportionally among the creditors. So a 500 Lumione note from the Remilio company would not be immediately worthless, even if the smuggling had failed. In short, Jacob bought the IOU up at an amount that corresponded to the smuggling gamble. Taking all those possibilities into account, Jacob had valued the IOU somewhat conservatively at 30 Lumione. If the smuggling succeeded, there was a promise of an additional 100 Lumione. That was significantly less than the face value of the IOU, but there was a high probability that the recovered Remilio company would still go bankrupt within 10 years. It was a reasonable price. Lawrence gave 20 Lumione to Jacob as a way of compensating for the damages caused to the Rowan Trade Guild's good name. He intended to use the rest that Jacob gave him as a bribe to keep the butchers quiet if they had to slaughter the sheep. With the 100 Lumione additional, he might have from the success of the smuggling. Lawrence had to compensate Nora for 20 Lumione she was due, and he planned to give more by way of apology to the various trading companies he had backed for loans. If that came to 30 Lumione, that was still left him with 50 for himself. Somehow he would be back to where he was when he sold off his pepper in Poroson. Given that at one point he had resigned himself to dying aboard a slave ship, this could be called a miracle. Next, Lawrence used his guild connections to get introduced to a butcher whose discretion could be trusted. He secured a promise from the butcher to receive the sheep from Nora and butcher them, no questions asked. Asked for 10 Lumione. He was paying the butcher very well. Let's see. Sorry. Was paying the butcher very well and had every expectation that things would proceed smoothly. After making the various preparations, Lawrence returned to the Remilio company to retrieve his clothes, and then left Remilio to round up and rehire his former employees who were probably all huddled together, shivering in the cold weather. Lawrence also ordered Remilio to return his cart, which he had forgotten about entirely. He was a bit sharp in saying so, as he expected his orders to be carried out quickly. By the time Lawrence finished his preparations, the night sky was beginning to pale with the dawn. He walked along the street quietly in the early morning. A chill still in the air from the previous day's rain. His destination was a tavern that was able to remain open all night, courtesy of bribes paid to the appropriate authorities. The distinctive pale blue sky of dawn hung over the city. An out-of-place lamp still burning marked the tavern. "Welcome!" A voice that greeted him was listless, not from illegitimacy necessarily, but rather from the exhaustion of staying up all night. The tavern was perhaps half full, though surprisingly quiet. The patrons drank their wine quietly, perhaps mourning the inevitable daybreak. "Ho there!" Lawrence turned to face the voice and found Hollow, who had appeared at his side holding a small cask and some bread. If a priest had spotted Holo, who was dressed again as a town girl in an all-night tavern, there might have been some real problems, but nobody seemed to mind her presence. Holo caught the eye of the tavern master behind the counter, and he sleepily waved to her. Holo probably charmed the goods she was carrying out of the master with some sweet talk. Come on, let's go. Lawrence had actually wanted to sit and rest for a moment, but he took Holo's hand and Holo took his hand and would not be argued with. Come again, said the tavern master as they left. The two had no particular destination for the time being, and for the time being were content to walk. It was cold outside, thanks to the humidity in the air. Thanks to the humidity, their breath hung in the air. Here, bread, said Holo. And Lawrence's stomach groaned as he realized that he had not eaten since midday the day before. Lawrence took the bread. Actually a bacon vegetable sandwich from the happily smiling Holo and bit into it without hesitation. Also this. Holo held out a small cask. Once he uncorked and put his lips to the cask, it proved to contain a warm mixture of meat and milk. "'Tis good for what ails you." The warm, sweet liquor was perfect. "Now then," said Holo, she probably hadn't meant the food and drink to loosen his tongue per se, but as he was finished eating, she began to speak. "I have 2 questions to put for you." Lawrence braced himself for the worst. Holo paused for a moment. "How far do you trust that girl?" She asked, not looking at him. It was a question he both had and had not expected. The fact Holo had left the time, place, and circumstance unclear meant that there was probably some vague doubt in her own mind. Lawrence took another drink from the cask. "I don't know how far I can trust her," he said without glancing at Holo. "However, I do know that if Nora were to take the gold and disappear somewhere, she would be easily followed. I don't trust her enough to think that would happen, and still have handed the gold." Holo was silent. Unless she travels a significant distance, no one will buy it up at a reasonable price, and tales of a shepherdess just happening to sell off gold are rare enough to travel far and wide. She would be easy enough to follow. It was certain that he did not trust Nora absolutely. As a merchant, Lawrence was always thinking about contingencies. "I see. I suppose that is the size of it, then." "And the other question?" Holo faced him with an inscrutable expression. It wasn't anger. It was perhaps hesitation. But hesitation about what? Lawrence wondered. He found it hard to imagine that she was vacillating over whether or not to ask the question. "Whatever it is, I'll answer it. I owe you a huge debt, after all." He took a bite of the now cold sandwich, washing it down with liquor. The golden light of dawn began to reflect the cobblestone streets. "Are you not going to ask it?" Holo took a deep breath and grabbed his sleeve. Her hand trembled, either because of the cold or something else. Hmm? Do you remember? Olo looked at him with uncertain eyes. When I was facing the dog and the girl, whose name did you call out? She did not appear to be joking. Her eyes were seriousness itself. The blood was rushing in my head, and I couldn't... The blood was rushing in my head, and I couldn't hear, but it's been gnawing at me. I'm quite sure you called someone else's name. Do you remember? Lawrence hesitated as they walked slowly through the city. The city streets, the sun now beginning to rise. How should he answer? The truth was that he didn't remember. But what if Hollow actually did remember, and she was only trying to get him to confirm it? If he had called Hollow's name, that would be fine. The problem would come if he had called for Nora. In that case, saying he didn't know would mean he blurted out Nora's name without really knowing or remembering what he was saying. And in that case, Hollow would certainly be angry. It would be better to honestly admit that he called Nora's name and come up with some vague reason why. There was another possibility, of course, that Hollow hadn't heard at all. In which case, it would be best to say he called her name. Having thought it through thoroughly, Lawrence realized the extent of his own stupidity. The girl next to him was Hollow. Was Spice&Wolf Hollow? She would see right through any lies. In which case, the correct answer was, I called your name. After looking for a moment in her eyes of an abandoned puppy, Hollow's eyes flashed with hatred. That's a lie. She tightened her grip on his sleeve. Lawrence answered immediately. It is. The truth is, I don't remember. However, Hollow's ears flicked underneath her kerchief on her head faster than her facial expression could change. She should know that what he had just said wasn't a lie. In circumstances, I certainly think I would have called your name, he said, looking steadily back at her. As quickly as her eyes had flashed with hatred, Hollow now looked at him with a hint of doubt in her gaze. There was no way to tell whether or not that was the truth. There was no way to tell whether or not that was the truth. She would have to decide. For his part, Lawrence put forth the most persuasive argument he could think of. Time was of the essence. I'm sure I would have unconsciously chosen to call your name after all. Hollow's grip tightened. After all, it's one letter shorter. After all, it's one letter shorter. He could almost feel the expression drop from her face. Also, if I'd shortened Nora even hastily, you'd be able to tell, but Hollow takes but a moment to say. It would be easy to miss with the blood roaring through your head. What do you think? Quite persuasive argument? He didn't finish his sentence because Hollow struck him with in the mouth. Shut up! Even with her small, soft hand, even her small, soft hand hurt quite a bit, since Lawrence's lip was split slightly where the Remilio Company Mook had struck him. So you called my name because it was shorter? Dunce! Fool! She said, yanking on his sleeve. It's infuriating that you would even think that. She looked flatly opposite him, as if to turn him away. Lawrence wondered if it would have been better to just tell him and to tell an obvious lie, but he had been feeling Hollow would have been angry either way. As they walked, they approached the east gate. There were more people around now, busily setting about their day. Hollow walked slightly in front of him alone. Just as he wondered what she was going to do, she stopped. Just... She stood there. Call it out, said Hollow. Her back turned to Lawrence. Past her, Lawrence saw a bell that... Lawrence saw a bell at the end of the long staff. He heard the bleating of sheep behind a figure. What he saw beyond Hollow was a shepherd girl leading a black sheepdog. In that very instant, he knew the smuggling had succeeded. He couldn't help but feel happy. He might have easily called out Nora's name. Lawrence smiled at Hollow's clever, bald-faced actions. The moment he opened his mouth to call the name, he sneezed. Now the truth of which name he called out would remain forever a mystery. Hollow looked over her shoulder. Chagrined, he gotten the better of her. Lawrence ignored her and waved broadly 3 times, just as when he had first met Nora on the road. Nora noticed and returned the wave. Hollow regarded Nora over her shoulder. That was the moment Lawrence was waiting for. Hollow. Her wolf ears twitched. Hollow really is easier to call. A puff of vapor appeared at Hollow's mouth as she exhaled, admitting defeat. You dunce. Lawrence loved her ticklish smile, when even more in the warm late autumn sunshine. And that is the end of the second book. Let me quickly change. Right. Oh. I really should find something for the fact that my eyes keep burning at the white light. Should just turn on the light. Well, either way, yeah. That is the end of the second part of Spice&Wolf. The book is interesting. It keeps coming up with better stories. I have no idea what to say. Yes. Yeah, I think I'm gonna end it just there. It's been a while, and like reading is tiring. But oh well. I think I'll take a break next week. Just play or take a break from reading. Play another game. I have a bunch of games I want to play. Play more Dead by Daylight. Play more Apex. Certainly play more Kiwami. Yakuza. Play more Nakapara and other stuff. There's a lot to do. So, but I think I will continue. It depends, maybe. I want to read more, but oh well. I'm rambling. I'm gonna end it there. Thank you all for watching. I hope you all enjoyed. And have a good night. And see you Thursday. Bye bye.